They came at dawn, not as an army, as a wall, a moving, breathing mass of steel, leather, and banners stretching from one horizon to the other. 26,000 soldiers advancing in perfect formation. Their footsteps shook the ground like a distant earthquake. Their war drums rolled like thunder through the valley, slow and steady, like the heartbeat of something enormous and merciless. Dust rose in thick clouds beneath their boots and hooves. Sunlight caught on thousands of blades at once, blinding flashes rippling across the field like waves on water. The sound of them carried for miles, a sound that meant only one thing to every village, every fortress, every refugee camp in the region: extermination. And in front of them, there were only 500. 500 knights. 500 men standing in silence, shoulder to shoulder, their horses breathing clouds of white steam into the cold morning air. Their armor was scarred, their shields chipped and cracked, their banners faded and torn. Many bore the marks of wounds that had never fully healed. They were not a fresh army. They were what remained. They knew the numbers. They had known them since the night before, when the scouts returned pale and shaking, whispering the count like a death sentence. 26,000. Infantry, heavy troops, cavalry, archers, engineers. Enough men to bury the valley in bodies twice over. By every law of war, by every lesson of history, by every cold calculation of survival, they were already dead. And yet, they charged. A wedge of armored cavalry smashed straight into the heart of an army more than 50 times their size. The impact ripped open the enemy's center like a blade through flesh. Formation collapsed. Command shattered. Panic spread faster than orders ever could. Men who had survived dozens of battles suddenly dropped their weapons and ran as if chased by ghosts. And within hours, one of the largest armies of its age ceased to exist. Not defeated, not delayed, destroyed. But this story does not begin with the charge. It begins with a war that should never have been fought. Years before the battle, the balance of power in the region had already broken. One side had land, wealth, supply lines, and nearly endless manpower. Their granaries overflowed, their forges burned day and night. Their recruiting officers never struggled to find bodies. The other side had ruins. City after city had fallen, some after sieges, some after betrayals, some without a single blade drawn. Fortresses that once took years to conquer now collapsed in weeks under constant pressure, starvation, and bombardment. Entire provinces surrendered without resistance, not because they supported the invaders, but because they understood what resistance now meant: executions, deportations, slavery. The enemy advanced not only with armies, but with terror. Their enemy was smaller, poorer, outnumbered, and running out of time. Every defeat meant more refugees flooding the remaining cities, more burned villages smoldering on the horizon, more names scratched from rosters, never to be replaced. Sons gone, fathers gone, brothers gone. By the time the final campaign began, the outcome of the war was no longer debated in war councils, only its timing. When enemy scouts reported the size of the approaching force, 26,000 troops moving toward a single decisive battlefield, the defending commanders understood immediately what it meant. This was not a raid, not a probe, not a limited engagement. This was annihilation. If their army was destroyed here, their kingdom would fall within weeks. The capital would follow. Then the last ports, then the mountain passes, then the people. Inside the War Council tent, maps covered every table. Candles burned through the night, melting into wax pools that ran like white rivers across parchment. Voices rose, arguments broke out. Strategies were proposed, destroyed, and rejected again. A defensive line would be surrounded and crushed. A retreat meant abandoning cities to slaughter. A direct engagement meant placing 500 against 26,000 in open battle. No formation in history could survive that. No shield wall, no spear hedge, no heroic last stand. It would be a massacre measured in minutes. By every rule of warfare, surrender was the only logical option. And yet, they did not surrender. Because surrender did not mean survival. It meant disappearance. The force they had left was not an army. It was a fragment. Survivors of earlier battles, veterans pulled from shattered units, knights who had outlived their regiments, men carrying old wounds beneath bandages that would never truly come off, men who slept sitting up because lying flat hurt too much. Some were barely more than boys, their armor still too large for them, their voices still breaking when they shouted commands. Others had already seen too much, their eyes empty in a way that never returned to normal. They were exhausted, underfed, outnumbered beyond reason. And still, they mounted their horses. These 500 knew the numbers. They had seen the scouts' reports. They knew that statistically none of them should return. They understood probability. They understood mass. They understood what 30,000 blades could do to 500 bodies. They also knew something else. There would be no mercy. If the enemy army reached their cities, the war would not end with treaties or ransoms. It would end with mass executions, enslaved families, and erased bloodlines. Their children would grow up speaking a different language, praying to different gods, knowing different names for their own grandparents. For many of the knights, retreat meant watching their own homes burn. For them, this battle was not about victory. It was about buying time, or dying before watching everything they protected disappear. The approaching force had already built a reputation that haunted every battlefield it touched. They were disciplined, experienced, systematic. They rotated units methodically. They advanced in waves. They broke resistance not only with steel, but with fear. Captured towns were not simply occupied. They were made into examples. Executions were public. Punishments were slow. Survivors were released on purpose, carrying stories designed to travel faster than armies. Their banners became warnings. Their advance became inevitable. And now, all 26,000 of them were advancing toward a single valley, where 500 armored knights waited in formation. At dawn, the enemy commanders believed they were marching toward an execution. They had no reason to think otherwise. The battlefield was a wide, open plain surrounded by low hills and broken forests, the kind of terrain generals loved when they outnumbered their enemy. Perfect for infantry, perfect for mass formations, perfect for surrounding and crushing a smaller force. Terrible for anyone hoping to escape. If the 500 were overwhelmed, there would be no retreat path, no choke point, no fallback position, no mountains to hide in. Only open ground, and thousands of pursuers. The enemy army began deploying in layers, infantry in the center, heavy troops behind, cavalry on the flanks, archers forming deep, overlapping kill zones, engineers preparing reserve bridges and field barricades. Once the lines closed, nothing inside them would survive. As the enemy formed up in the distance, the 500 gathered one last time. There were no speeches about glory, no promises of victory, no illusions left, no lies strong enough to survive the truth that stood before them on the horizon. Only a simple truth. A normal battle meant extinction. And that was when the plan was revealed. It was not a defensive strategy. It was not an orderly retreat. It was not even a battle plan in the traditional sense. It was a single, violent decision. A single, irreversible commitment. They would not try to survive the enemy. They would try to break it. In one strike. Instead of forming a line, they would form a wedge, a narrow, armored spearhead of cavalry. Every knight aligned shoulder to shoulder, every shield locked, every lance angled forward. Not a wall, a spear. No reserves, no fallback, no second chance. They would aim not for the flanks, not for the supply lines, not for the rear. They would charge directly into the center of the enemy army, straight at its command corps, straight into the deepest concentration of troops, straight into the place no cavalry charge should ever go. If they failed, they would be swallowed in seconds, crushed by mass, pulled from their saddles, trampled beneath thousands of boots. If they succeeded, something unprecedented would happen. Something armies were not designed to survive. The enemy drums began to beat. The dust cloud rose on the horizon. The valley filled with the sound of 30,000 men preparing to collide. Horses stamped, leather creaked, steel clicked. The 500 lowered their lances. The wedge tightened. The front ranks leaned forward in their saddles. Some closed their eyes. Some whispered prayers. Some simply stared. There would be no retreat. There would be no rescue. There would be no witnesses, except history. And then, the charge began. The ground trembled. At first, it was only a vibration beneath the horses' hooves. Then it became a roar that climbed up through bone and into the chest. 500 war horses launched forward as one. No scattered movement, no hesitation. Only a single, unified surge of steel and muscle. The cavalry wedge accelerated across the valley like a living projectile. Dust exploded behind them. Wind tore at banners. Armor screamed against armor. Straight ahead, 26,000 men stood waiting to receive them. From the enemy lines, the charge looked almost absurd. Too small, too narrow, too focused. An arrow fired at a wall. Officers laughed. Infantry tightened ranks. Archers raised bows. They had seen cavalry charges before. They had crushed dozens of them. The first arrows screamed through the air. They fell like black rain. Shields lifted. Several knights were struck and vanished beneath their horses, crushed under charging weight before they ever hit the ground. But the wedge did not slow. It grew tighter. The front ranks leaned even lower, lances leveled. At 200 meters, enemy infantry locked shields. At 100 meters, they braced spears. At 50 meters, fear finally reached their eyes. Then came the impact. It was not a clash. It was an explosion. The front of the enemy formation folded inward as if hit by a battering ram. Lances punched through shields. Bodies were lifted off the ground. Men were thrown backward into their own ranks, breaking their formation from the inside. The wedge did not stop. It penetrated. Men died without even understanding how. Horses smashed through bodies. Steel tore through flesh. The center of the enemy army ruptured. Formations shattered. Commands vanished under the noise. Within seconds, the charge carved a corridor of destruction straight through the heart of a force 50 times larger. Inside the enemy ranks, confusion turned into panic. No one understood what had happened. Messages could not move. Officers were unhorsed or crushed. Units lost visual contact with one another. The most dangerous moment in any battle had arrived. Not when one side is losing, but when it no longer understands what is happening. The wedge pushed deeper, and deeper, and deeper. Each meter multiplied the chaos behind it. By the time the cavalry reached the command zone, the enemy army was no longer an army. It was a crowd. Reality returned with violence. The enemy reacted fast. Too fast. Cavalry units broke from the flanks. Heavy infantry turned inward. Archers redirected fire. The wedge was now surrounded on all sides. Horses screamed. Men were pulled from saddles. Axes found gaps in armor. One by one, the front knights fell. The wedge began to bleed. For the first time, it slowed. For the first time, it stalled. For the first time, it almost stopped. The enemy surged. Thousands pressed inward. Mass overwhelmed formation. Several knights vanished beneath a sea of bodies. Others fought on foot, surrounded, buried in steel. The wedge was collapsing from the front. If it broke here, everything would end. Then, the rear ranks crashed forward. The reserve momentum slammed into the stall point. The formation retightened, the pressure reversed, and the wedge moved again. Not fast, not clean, but unstoppable. The command sector was gone. Signals failed. Orders contradicted one another. Units moved blindly. Some advanced, others retreated.
Many simply froze. The psychological collapse was faster than the physical one. Men began to believe they were already surrounded, that defeat was complete, that escape was the only option. One company broke, then another. Then entire regiments turned and ran. And panic is contagious. The rear formations, seeing thousands fleeing toward them, believed the battle was lost. Before orders could correct them, they ran too. What followed was not strategy, it was instinct. 26,000 men turned into a tidal wave of retreat. Weapons were dropped, shields were thrown aside. Armor was cut loose for speed. The 500 emerged from the collapsing center like ghosts, blood-soaked, broken, still mounted, still moving. And now, they became hunters. Small groups pursued, slashed, cut down stragglers. Some enemies drowned in rivers, some vanished into forests. Most never made it home. By nightfall, the valley was silent. Victory had a cost. Of the 500 who charged, less than 200 remained mounted. Many were mortally wounded. Some would not survive the night. They stood among the dead in silence, surrounded by thousands of fallen enemies, unable to speak, unable to celebrate. They had not won by numbers. They had won by breaking reality. News traveled faster than armies. The destruction of the 26,000 spread across kingdoms like wildfire. Allies regained hope. Enemies reconsidered every advance. Neutral powers began choosing sides. A war that had been considered lost was suddenly alive again. The victory was not magic. It was physics, psychology, timing, terrain, speed, shock. The cavalry wedge exploited the only fragile point in any mass army, its mind. Remove the center, and the body dies. History remembers numbers, kings, empires, but sometimes it remembers a moment, a decision, a charge. 500 riders against an army that should have erased them, and the impossible happened. If you want more stories of battles that should never have been won, subscribe, because history still has many blood-soaked miracles left.